I am Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. I'm back for this episode. It's the end of June, most likely, when it's going to air, and you will be hearing this. I was just in Taiwan. I took the whole family there. I think I've mentioned this on the podcast previously, but my dissertation and my academic research, it's focused more on museums, and way back in the halcyon days of late 2019, I received some money to do some research in Taiwan on Taiwanese museums. I was going to take that research and incorporate it into my dissertation. I had 3 chapters on China's museums and another chapter on Taiwanese museums. 2020 happened, and so I didn't get to go to Taiwan. I went ahead, I finished my dissertation without the chapter on Taiwanese museums, but I still had that money with my name on it lying around in some bank somewhere. So I decided that now I would do a trip to Taiwan, do my research anyways, and then use the trip to maybe talk to some people who could help with my journalistic work. I also got the chance to meet a really cool fan of the podcast, something that's always really fun. While in Taiwan, I got to visit the grave of Hu Shi, the author of 差不多先生, Mr. Almost, Mr. 差不多. As those of y'all who are regular listeners to the podcast, y'all will remember, on May 13th, I aired an episode about that short satirical essay. Hu Shi is buried there in Taipei, just outside of Academia Sinica, the think tank where he was very much involved. He actually died in Academia Sinica. He had a heart attack on the floor of one of the Academia Sinica buildings. So while I was actually at Academia Sinica, I went there to his grave and bye-bye, and I showed my respects up there on that hillside where you can see into Academia Sinica. Also, as a side note, not a lot of people know this, but the greatest museum in the Chinese world that no one knows about is actually located in Academia Sinica. It's in the Museum of the Institute for History and Philology, and it's incredible both in terms of the artifacts that it has and the fact that no one knows about it. Lots of people know about that most famous of museums in the Chinese world, also located in Taipei. The National Palace Museum, the Gugong Boyuan. But no one, and I mean nobody, knows about this other museum with the Institute for History and Philology. Part of the reason no one knows about it is because it's located so far from the hustle and bustle of Taipei's center, but also it's not well known because it's only open on Wednesdays, Saturdays, and Sundays, so it's kind of a pain to make sure you get there on the right day. But seriously, this museum has an amazing collection. They've got oracle bones. I talked about oracle bones in the episode that aired on January 21st, that first solo episode I did. You can actually go and look at these stunningly interesting, it's mostly tortoise shells, but some different animal bones. And carved into them, you have the oldest form of the written Chinese language. It was really cool. Maybe I'm a nerd and I like to see that kind of stuff, but I really enjoyed it. Much of the rest of the museum is other amazing stuff that they've dug up. The Institute did 15 seasons of digs between 1928 and 1937. Much of the cool stuff that they have is on display. They had a small pile of human skulls that was dug up. These are skulls from a human sacrifice. Human sacrifice during the Shang Dynasty was very, very big. The Shang Dynasty is the civilization that practiced the most human sacrifice in the world. Very cool museum. Highly recommended if you are interested in Taipei. Wow. I really got sidetracked there. I guess because I was talking about Hu Shi and the oracle bones, it was kind of related to the podcast, but let me see if I can get us back onto the podcast. The real reason I wanted to mention all of this is while I was in Taipei, I got the opportunity to join a cool group of people. There's a journalist named Brian. He was a grad student studying Chinese literature at Columbia, but he decided to go back to Taiwan. He founded a leftist journalistic outfit called New Bloom. The writing is mostly in English, although there is some Chinese. The magazine focuses mostly on Taiwanese politics. He and some of his merry band of friends are running a small literary discussion group that meets every couple of months, I guess. They talk about Taiwanese short story and it's in English and Chinese, both the discussion and the short story. They provide a translation of the work in English. They get together one night over beers in the basement of New Bloom, and they discuss the story. If you happen to be in Taipei and want to get together with some folks to talk literature, I'd highly recommend you check them out. They're located quite close to Wanhua train station there in Taipei. I think they're doing their next story in September. While I was there in May, I actually got the chance to join them for a discussion of a story by an author named Li Hikaru. In Chinese, that's Li Bingyao. On her website, the first thing she tells us about herself is, first, she's a literary worker. Second, she's a cat lover, Mao Pai. As many of y'all know from the episode I did with Laszlo Montgomery, I myself am a cat lover. I'm an allurophile. So obviously, her credentials check out for me. Third thing that that you should know about her, she's a gay activist in Taiwan. She is the head of the LGBTQ Taiwan Equality Campaign. But when she's not working, she is writing. And as a part of this group that meets up in New Bloom, I was able to read one of her stories. The story is called 百年百合. The English translation that her translation gave is Centennial Harmony, Centennial Lilies. Her story and the English translation of that story, I'm going to post a link to them on my website, ChineseLiteraturePodcast.com. Now, I need to warn you, this episode of the podcast is going to talk about the plot of the story, and I'm going to spoil the twist. So if you want to read the story first, I strongly recommend you pause, go to my website, find the link, read Lee's story, and then come back to the podcast. Again, this is a spoiler alert. If you want to read her story first, do that now, and then come back to the rest of the episode. Okay, now that I've gotten that out of the way, here is the plot line. The story begins with a protagonist. Her name in English is Gina. Her Chinese name is Lin Yating. She's gay, and it seems she's not really out of the closet, or she hasn't spent much time out of the closet. She gets on a dating app. She's starting to talk to different girls. She meets a girl. Her name is Kotoko. The story mostly refers to her as Kotoko, but her Chinese name, we find out, is Wang Xiuqin. Gina falls in love with Kotoko before they actually physically meet. They're just talking. Kotoko has struggled to find people who accept her homosexuality. Her family has tried to force her into matchmaking to get her married. Before Kotoko and Gina have a face-to-face meeting, they go ahead, they decide to move in together. A little far-fetched, but wait for it. When the pair are supposed to actually meet up and move in together, Kotoko does this weird thing. Instead of actually meeting with Gina, she leaves a red envelope on the ground outside of Gina's house for Gina to pick up. Gina does pick it up, and she finds a lock of hair and Kotoko's Chinese name, Wang Xiuqian. By leaving a red envelope with a lock of hair and her name on it, it apparently binds you into this marriage, whether or not you are willing. After this, Gina finds out that Kotoko is not who she thought she was. Kotoko is a lesbian girl. She's 19, and she was born in the year 1937. And she's been dead for a little bit more than a half century. Being born when she was, had trouble finding a wife. Apparently, anti-gay laws extended into the world of the dead. As the story develops, it turns out that this is going to be a gay ghost marriage. Gina ends up, after some discussion with Kotoko, she ends up consenting to this ghost marriage. The story ends before we know if they live happily ever after, but I kind of read it as a happily ever after ending. The story ends with Gina feeling the press of Kotoko as Kotoko arrives in the marriage chamber while Gina is drinking wine and watching TV. A very modern tableau, if you ask me. Okay, there's a lot to unpack with this story. First, let's talk about ghost marriage. Oftentimes, in traditional China, you would have ghost marriages. These come in a variety of forms, but they are something that are common in Chinese tradition. Oftentimes, what would happen is you would have a son. he would die before his parents could marry him off. The parents would, being concerned about their lineage and the continuation of their name, the parents would find and pay a girl, generally a poor girl, I believe, to marry him to, that is the dead son, even though he is dead and in the grave. They would marry him off to this girl. The marriage is completely ratified by society. It's socially acceptable, although I think even in traditional China, this was considered a bit weird and not, the fate that you wanted if you were a woman. It was not something that people would consent to unless they were in pretty dire straits. Obviously, the marriage is not consummated, even if it is socially accepted. What would happen is that the wife and the dead husband would adopt a son. So there was this kind of imagined marriage. They would have an imagined child. This is completely legitimate in Chinese tradition. You could adopt a son, and they would allow for the family name to continue on. And that's really the thing that's a big deal in Chinese tradition. So the son would be able to continue to perform the sacrifices necessary in Chinese folk religion that would prevent the spirits of the ancestors of the family from becoming hungry ghosts who roam the land and harass people. In modern Taiwan, I've never heard of anyone caring much about ghost marriages. I doubt ghost marriages still happen, but you never know. What I find interesting about this story is it's clearly comparing the practice of ghost marriage to gay marriage. One practice looks weird to us now as moderns, but to people in the past, it would have seemed totally normal. The other practice looks normal to us now, but to people in the past, it would have seemed totally weird. And that is where one of the best lines in the story comes from. I'm going to read the translation. So after Gina has found out that she's kind of been forced into this ghost marriage, she asks a friend this question: what's more difficult, gay marriage or ghost marriage? A friend takes the lead in answering. Gay marriage, of course. It was only legalized in May this year. Ghost marriages have existed for thousands of years. It's harder to be queer than to be a ghost. As this line indicates, it appears the reason Kotoko approaches Gina and tries to get her into this ghost marriage is at least partially because gay marriage has just been legalized. It's not entirely clear from the story. It's kind of left ambiguous, but that is my reading of the story. Taiwan, of course, was the first country in Asia to legalize gay marriage starting in 2019. So Kotoko, the ghost, she gets on a smartphone and she starts dating on gay apps, apparently just because Taiwan legalized gay marriage. So now gay ghost can get married to humans in Taiwan at this point. It's all very weird, but within the fictional world that Lee, the author, sets up, it's really quite an interesting story. So the issue of marriage, homosexuality, and the law, that's one thing I wanted to discuss. But a second thing I wanted to discuss is how pregnant this story is with questions of identity. At the very beginning of this discussion, I mentioned that the author on her website lists her English name as Lee Hiraku. Hiraku is, of course, not Chinese, but it's Japanese. With Chinese and Japanese, of course, they use Hanzi and Kanji, so you can have a name that could be either Japanese or Chinese, and looking at it, sometimes you cannot tell. Her name appears to be Chinese. As best I can tell, the author is born in a Chinese family, but she has adopted this Japanese romanization of her name. The author's website is hakurukaru.com. The website itself is written entirely in Chinese. There's no English. The website has no Japanese. She doesn't really explain much about her biography, so I can't be 100% sure, but I think she was born speaking Chinese. I think that is her mother tongue. I have met some people in Taiwan who are both Japanese and Han Chinese/Taiwanese, but I have also met some Taiwanese people who grew up in Taiwan, have never been to Japan, and yet still prefer, when they anglicize their names, they prefer to use the Japanese pronunciation of their names, Hanzi, rather than the Mandarin pronunciation. I suspect that is what is going on. So even before I started reading the story, when I saw her name, I had this question. How does the author position herself in terms of identity? A very important question when you're talking about Taiwanese authors. In China, of course, there is a lot of hatred marshaled against the Japanese. Last August, a woman was arrested purely for wearing a kimono in Suzhou. In Taiwan, Japan and Taiwan's connection with Japan are celebrated. So having this Chinese name, which she transliterates into a sort of Japanese version, is kind of strange to me, but it's also not completely unthinkable. It's hard to know what to make of it, but I think it's interesting, and I think as the first thing that I saw in the story, I had to note it, and I had to go, okay, what's going on here in terms of her identity? Now, it's far from the only question of identity that the story brings up. The beginning of the story contains this meditation on names. As I mentioned, the protagonist is named both Gina and Li Yating. The first passage of the story has this long meditation on how, when she enters the online world, she occupies this new persona, Gina, which is quite different from the persona and the personality that she adopts when she's in the offline world. And when I was reading this story, I wondered, the story is about who she is. Like, that's the thing. Who is she? That's what I was wondering. That's one of the main questions hovering over this story. Who is this person? Is she Gina? Is she Lin Yating? What is identity? What is the role of identity? What is its importance? Is identity something that we can choose? Is it something that's inborn within us? Is the name we are given who we truly are? Or can we escape this world, pass into a virtual world, and be someone else? There are also a lot of lines in terms of identity that are being crossed in this story. So you have the line between the virtual online world and the offline world. You have the line between the living and the dead. And you have the line between the sort of heteronormative straight world and the gay world. And that is the part of this story that I was most fascinated by. The way the author takes this discussion of homosexuality, which in terms of Chinese culture is a relatively new discussion, or at least the terms of it that it's being discussed in today are relatively new. Homosexuality has been around in China for a couple of thousand years, if not longer, but the framework of the discussion is quite new, and it's been imported from mostly the US. So this author, she takes this discussion of homosexuality and she juxtaposes it next to this discussion of ghost marriage, and she compares the two. So you have this very new discussion right next to this very old, ancient Chinese tradition of marriage. And she goes, oh, which one is more difficult, gay marriage or ghost marriage? All right, I've banged on for longer than I expected. Sorry, I think I got sidetracked at the beginning of the podcast. Today, I'm not going to end with a chengyu, but just a short phrase, 断袖. This literally means cut sleeve. It's a reference to a story in the Han Shu, that's the history of the Han, written during the Han dynasty by Bangu and Banbiao, Bangu's daughter. The story refers to an emperor, Emperor Ai. He was gay, or at least he had sexual relationships with men. The cut sleeve refers specifically to how, when he was sleeping with his lover, the political and military figure Dongxian was asleep and on the emperor's sleeve. Even though he was an emperor and could order people around, Emperor Ai did not want to wake him. So Emperor Ai cut off his own sleeve in order to not wake Dongxian. It's a very famous story in Chinese history, Chinese literature, and for a long time, homosexuality was referred to simply as 断袖之癖, that is the passion / addiction / craziness of the cut sleeve. So when you see a reference to the cut sleeve, when you're looking at Chinese literature, that's what they're talking about. All right, go to the website, ChineseLiteraturePodcast.com. I'll have a link to the story, both the Chinese original and the English translation. If you are in Taipei, I would highly recommend dropping by New Bloom, buy a beer, in order to support them, drop in on their short story discussion. If you feel like supporting what I do here at the Chinese Literature Podcast, you can become a patron on Patreon, Chinese Literature Podcast. Look me up. If you want to reach out to me with an email, my email address is ChineseLiteraturePodcast@gmail.com. That is it for today. I am Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. 再见.